Welcome in, everyone. Ready to go beyond the headlines.
Always.
Today, we're airdropping you right into the heart of Sri Lanka, around 2005.
A pivotal time.
The nation's grappling with the aftermath of a brutal civil war, and we're digging into the nitty-gritty of peace building in that kind of volatile setting.
Definitely not your average day at the office.
Right. We've got our hands on some pretty incredible documents, internal field reports from USI, giving us that raw, on-the-ground perspective,
Straight from the trenches.
and academic studies on actually measuring the impact of peace building.
The million-dollar question, does it actually work?
So imagine Sri Lanka in 2005. Places like Batticaloa, Trincomalee, Amperai. These weren't just names on a map, they were battlegrounds.
Scarred by violence, trying to find their footing.
And get this, the team evaluating one of the peace-building programs arrived during a period of intense fighting, like airstrikes happening while they were there.
Talk about a crash course in conflict zones. It really underscores the dedication, the sheer resilience of those working in these environments.
Absolutely. And one of the strategies that I found really interesting, almost unconventional, was the focus on engaging religious leaders.
It's more intuitive than you might think. In many cultures, and Sri Lanka's no exception, religious figures hold immense moral authority.
Right. Their words carry weight.
Exactly. They can influence how people in their communities think, how they act, their whole worldview.
So bringing them on board, getting them to champion peace building, that's tapping into an existing well of trust.
You've got it. It legitimizes the efforts in the eyes of the community, encourages them to, maybe give peace a chance.
And it makes you think, doesn't it? Could that influence, that moral authority, actually spill over into the political sphere?
Now, that's an intriguing thought.
Could these religious leaders create that space, that safe haven, where political leaders who are usually at each other's throats might actually come to the table?
It's a long shot, but the potential ripple effects are huge, and it highlights the importance of those soft outcomes in peace building.
Shifting attitudes, building trust.
The stuff you can't measure with a yardstick.
Exactly. Which leads to the million-dollar question. How do you actually measure a change in attitude? Or an increase in, say, trust between communities?
That's where those academic studies we mentioned come in. They're wrestling with that very question, trying to develop methodologies to evaluate these programs, especially in situations where success is a pretty slippery concept.
It's not as simple as, say, counting how many ceasefires hold, is it?
Not at all. It's far more nuanced than that.
One study we dug into used examples like anti-smoking campaigns and sex education programs.
Everyday interventions, but with complex goals.
And what's interesting is they found that even when a program was deemed successful, it achieved its objective during. The initial assumptions about why it worked were sometimes way off.
It's like you can have a perfectly sound theory, a well-designed intervention, and reality just veers off script.
Which seems even more likely in a place like Sri Lanka, right? You're dealing with decades of deeply ingrained animosity.
The human element throws a wrench in the works every time. It makes you realize there's no simple answer key for peace building.
No easy answers. Speaking of tough challenges, there's also the issue of scaling things up. You might have a program that works beautifully in a small village,
A pilot project with promising results.
but replicating that success across an entire country, that's a whole different ballgame.
It's like the difference between, say, baking a good loaf of bread and, running a successful bakery. The skills are related, but the scale is completely different.
You need more than just a good recipe. And that's where the importance of truly understanding the local context can't be overstated.
Couldn't agree more. What works in one village might completely backfire in another.
It's about recognizing that every community has its own unique history, its own cultural dynamics, its own power struggles.
You can't just take a cookie-cutter approach to peace building.
Definitely not. So before you even start designing a program, you need to really understand the DNA of the conflict you're trying to address.
And that's where something called conflict analysis comes in.
Exactly. And it's an aspect that often gets overlooked. Imagine a doctor prescribing medication without diagnosing the illness. It doesn't quite work, does it?
Recipe for disaster. And speaking of the people working on the ground, those field reports we mentioned, they paint a really vivid picture of the day-to-day realities of this work. It's not just theories and strategies. It's about real people grappling with real challenges.
Did you see the bit about Justin Sherman having to cut his leave short because things were escalating?
I did. It's a small detail, but it speaks volumes about the commitment, the adaptability required in this line of work.
And those reports remind us that it's not just about avoiding making things worse. Peace building has to be about creating something better.
A positive impact, a lasting change, that's the goal.
It's that tangible impact that's so important, isn't it?
Yeah.
But how do you actually measure something as elusive as peace?
Ah, the million-dollar question in peace building. It's not like there's a universal yardstick, right?
Definitely not. What signals success in Sri Lanka might look totally different in, say, Afghanistan or Colombia.
Each context is so unique. But that's where those academic studies get really interesting, digging into the methodologies for measuring impact, especially when success is a bit of a moving target.
And they're looking at this across different fields, not just conflict zones, right?
Exactly. One study we found fascinating looked at anti-smoking campaigns and how effective they were in actually changing behavior.
So not just whether people knew smoking was bad, but if they actually quit.
Exactly. And what they found was even when a campaign worked, people actually did quit smoking. The reasons why were often more complex than initially thought.
It's like those assumptions about human behavior. Sometimes they're spot on and sometimes they're totally off the mark.
And those nuances, those unexpected factors, they're amplified in a place like Sri Lanka, emerging from decades of conflict.
Absolutely. It's not just about stopping the fighting. It's about addressing the root causes, the deep-seated mistrust, the trauma.
And that's where this idea of local ownership becomes absolutely crucial, which was a recurring theme in those USAID field reports, wasn't it?
It was. It's that idea of you can't just impose peace from the outside.
Right. It has to come from within. It's about empowering those communities, giving them a voice in shaping their own future.
So what does that look like on the ground? How do you ensure that local voices are actually heard, especially in a context as sensitive and volatile as post-conflict Sri Lanka?
Well, for one, it means engaging a broad spectrum of stakeholders right from the get-go, and not just the usual suspects, government officials, community leaders, but going deeper.
Bringing in women, youth, marginalized groups, people who might not typically have a seat at the table.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that peace, it's not a one-size-fits-all concept. What resonates with one community might not work in another. So you need that diversity of perspectives, that local knowledge to develop solutions that actually stick.
Because a peace agreement signed in a capital city might mean very little to a village still struggling with the scars of war.
Precisely. Local ownership means understanding those nuances, those hyper-local contexts, and tailoring your approach accordingly.
So instead of saying, here's the peace plan, follow it, it's more about asking, what does peace mean to you, and how can we work together to achieve it?
How you're talking. It's about shifting the power dynamics, making those communities active participants, not passive recipients.
And that takes us back to something we discussed earlier, conflict analysis. That deep dive into understanding the roots of the conflict before you even start talking solutions.
It's the groundwork, isn't it? Like you wouldn't build a house on a shaky foundation. You need to know what you're dealing with.
So before you can even think about building peace, you need to understand the very architecture of the conflict.
Absolutely. The historical grievances, the power dynamics, the vested interests, it all factors in. And that analysis, it needs to be done in partnership with those communities, listening to their experiences, understanding their perspectives.
Because they're the ones who have lived through it, who understand the fault lines, the triggers, the potential pitfalls better than anyone.
Precisely. And that takes us back to the challenge of measurement. How do you capture that local knowledge, those lived experiences, in a way that can actually inform program design and track progress?
Right, because it's one thing to talk about building peace, but how do we know if it's actually happening? What are those indicators, those signs of progress?
It's about looking beyond just the absence of violence, which is often the default metric, and digging deeper.
Looking for those subtle shifts in attitudes, in behaviors, in the way people interact with each other.
Exactly. Are people more willing to send their kids to schools with children from the other community? Are they participating in community events together? Are they starting to rebuild those broken relationships?
Those everyday acts of reconciliation, those little cracks where the light starts to seep in.
Precisely. And that's where those field reports we keep coming back to, they offer such valuable insights.
Because they capture those anecdotal nuggets, those human stories that paint a much richer picture than just, say, statistics on ceasefire violations.
Absolutely. Remember that anecdote from one report about the village elders who finally agreed to share a cup of tea after years of refusing to even speak to each other?
Small gesture, huge symbolic significance, and that's something you can't capture in a spreadsheet.
Exactly. It's in those small victories, those everyday acts of courage and compassion, that the true measure of peace can be found.
It's like you said earlier, those tiny cracks where the light starts to get through. Those stories, those moments of human connection, they're what make all the difference.
They really do. And those field reports, they highlighted something else that's crucial for successful peace-building adaptability. Being able to adjust your approach based on the ever-changing realities on the ground.
Because you can't just have a one-size-fits-all peace plan.
Right. Exactly. What works in one phase of a conflict might not be appropriate or effective in another. In those early days after the ceasefire in Sri Lanka, just getting people from opposing sides to sit down together, to even talk to each other, that was a huge step.
Breaking down those barriers, building those initial bridges.
Exactly. But as the situation stabilized, the conversations needed to evolve too. They had to start addressing those deeper, more systemic issues that fueled the conflict in the first place.
So moving beyond just we agree not to shoot each other to how do we fix the systems that led us to this point?
Precisely. Issues like land rights, political representation, justice for past atrocities, these are complex, deeply rooted problems that require a much more nuanced and long-term approach. It's like, you can build a beautiful house, but if it's built on a shaky foundation, it's not going to stand the test of time.
You need that solid groundwork.
Hmm.
And that kind of adaptability, it's not just important for the folks on the ground, right? It's crucial for the donors funding these peace-building initiatives as well.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, too many donors still approach peace building with this kind of checklist mentality, like we need to see X number of peace committees established or Y number of people trained in conflict resolution techniques. But it's just not that simple.
Real change, lasting peace,
Yeah.
it's so much more organic than that.
Exactly. It's about investing in those less tangible, harder to measure outcomes like trust, social cohesion, a sense of shared purpose. And that requires a different kind of donor mindset, one that's more flexible, more patient, more willing to embrace uncertainty and take risks.
Because peace-building isn't a quick fix, it's a long game.
It absolutely is. And it's a game that requires all hands on deck. Policymakers, donors, practitioners, even everyday citizens, we all have a role to play in creating a more peaceful world. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the complexities of peace building in Sri Lanka, what are some key takeaways for our listener? What have we learned from those firsthand accounts, from those academic studies that we can carry with us?
Well, I think one of the most important lessons is that peace-building is not a spectator sport. It's not something that happens in some far-off land that we read about in the news. It's a process that demands our attention, our engagement, our willingness to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
And it's about understanding that peace is not just the absence of violence. It's the presence of justice, of equality, of opportunity for all. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued.
Where differences are seen as strengths, not threats.
Exactly. And that's a world worth striving for.
It certainly is. And we hope this deep dive has given you, our listeners, a new perspective on what it takes to build that world, one community, one conversation, one act of courage at a time. Thank you for joining us.